Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay, welcome to Weekly Marks, 5th of September. We'll begin in a second. We're up to about page 840. We're still in chapter 6 of the economic manuscripts of 1864 to 65, the folks Mosley translation, and it may seem a little fragmented, even boring, but it is the original text of the manuscripts from the Miga translation. It is before Engels, the Engels editing version, and it has some, I think it's slightly different, not that different. I think Engels certainly captures the importance of the text, but it's useful to see the translated manuscripts just for the to see what Marx was thinking, and it's a little closer, as one might say, than Engels' edit. Here, rent simply rises as a result of increased capital investment on the land, and in proportion to this increase of capital, this increase in the product and in rent proportionally to the extra capital as a result of and in proportion to increased capital investment is just the same as far as the amount of product and rent is concerned, as if the cultivated area of the better types of land had increased and these were cultivated with the same capital investment as the same types of land were previously. And then he talks about how it doubles in chapter 2. This case also has the underlying assumption that there has been no improvement, no more fruitful application of capital, but simply an even and constant application of more capital in the same area with the same result as before. As with Ricardo in that sense. Here, all proportionate ratios remain the same. However, if we consider not the proportionate differences, but the purely arithmetical ones, the differential rent on the various types of land can alter. Let us assume, for example, that the extra capital has been invested solely on B and D. Remember, there's A, B, C, and D. The difference between D and A is then 7s against 3 before. Between B and A is 3s against 1 before. And between C and B, it is -1 instead of +1. But this arithmetical difference, which is decisive in the case of differential rent 1, insofar as it expresses the difference in productivity for the same capital investment, is here quite immaterial, since it is simply the result of different further investment or non-investment of capital given a constant difference for equal portion of capital on the various land. Now, that's a long way of talking about certain constants, but needless to say, the extra capitals bring forth an extra product in proportion to the surplus product of the portions of capital first invested, and thus form surplus profits, though at a declining rate, and not in proportion to the increase in their size. Now, we get to, for example, table 3, and once again, immaterial whether the extra investments, the investments made the second time around on the same land, fall uniformly on the various types of land or not. Whether the declining production of surplus product proceeds in equal or unequal proportions, whether the additional capital investments all fall on the same rent-bearing type of land, or whether they are distributed uniformly or not on rent-bearing lands of different quality. All these factors are immaterial for the laws to be developed here. The only assumption is that extra capital investments on any of the rent-bearing land types yield surplus profit, but in declining proportion to the increase in capital. In the examples given in the above table, the limits of this decline lie between 3/4 or 9 pounds, which is the rent on the first capital investment of the best land. And yes, there's a lot, but the law is that the rent on these types of land grows absolutely, even if not in proportion to the additional capital invested. If the rate of decline of the surplus product is given, the rent increases on a piece of land in proportion to the quantity of capital successively invested, the quantity of excess capital. If the amount of capital is given, the rent declines in proportion to the rate of decline in the productivity of the excess capital. Page 506 of the manuscript, the rate of surplus profit declines in relation to both the extra capital and the total capital invested on the land, but the absolute amount of surplus profit increases just as the falling rate of profit on capital in general is usually combined with an increasing absolute mass of profit. The average surplus profit for the capital investment on B, for example, is now 90% on the capital, while for the first capital investment, it was 120%. The total surplus profit, however, increases from 1/4 to 1.5 quarters, and from 3 pounds to 4 pounds 10 shillings. The total rent taken by itself, and not in relation to the doubled sum of capital advanced, has risen absolutely, as is shown by the phenomenon that the corn rent rises from 1/4 to 1.5 quarters, and the money rent from 3 pounds to 4 pounds 10 shillings. The differences in the rents from the different types of land and their relationship to one another may change in this case, but the change in their differences is here the result and not the cause of the comparative increase in rents. 4. The case in which the extra capital investments are bound up with rising rates of surplus profit requires no further analysis. It's self-evident that on this assumption, rents per acre rise, and in a higher ratio than the extra capital, wherever the extra investments have taken place. In this case, the extra capital investment is combined with improvement. This includes the case in which a small influx of extra capital produces the same or a greater effect than the previous addition of a larger amount. This case is not entirely identical with the earlier one, and this is a distinction which is important for all capital investments. For instance, 100 gives a profit of 10 when applied in a particular form, and 200 a profit of 40. The profit has risen from 10 to 20%, and in this respect, it is the same as if 50, applied in a more effective way, gave a profit of 10 instead of 5. Now, we assume here that the profit is bound up with a proportionate increase in the product. But the difference is that in the one case, I have to double the capital, while in the other one, I produce produce the doubled effect with the same capital as before. It is certainly not the same whether I produce A, the same product as before with half as much living and objectified labor, B, double the previous product with the same labor, or C, use twice as much labor capital, that is, to produce a proportionately higher product, say 4 times the amount. In the first case, labor is set free in either living or objectified form and can be applied elsewhere. The power of disposition over labor and capital is increased. Power of disposition, I think, is an important point. Anyway, back to the text. The setting free of capital and labor is in itself an increase in wealth, and it has exactly the same effect as if this extra capital were obtained by accumulation, but it saves on the work of accumulation. The difference can also be shown in this way. If in case A, I continued to work with the same capital, I obtain the same result as in B, but in B, I do not obtain the same result as in A. It is assumed here that in order to double the product, I must apply, that is table I, must Table 1 must apply the same quantity of labor and capital as it did before. In A, the product has in fact been quadrupled in proportionate terms if Table 1 uses the same amount of labor instead of half as much, and when Table 1 uses the same amount of labor instead of half as much labor, and when it uses double the amount, there will be an eightfold increase in the product. Case C is related to case B exactly as case B is related to case A. Even so, it is relatively unfavorable, and still more unfavorable when compared to A. Case C can only occur when double the amount of capital, double the amount of labor is available or is withdrawn from other areas where it was applied until then. For the determination of value, the situation is exactly the same. Let us assume that a capital of 100 has produced a product of 10 L's. Say that this capital contains as much constant capital as it does living labor and profit. The cost of an L is therefore 10. If Table 1 can then produce 20 L's with the same capital of 200, the cost of an L falls to 5. If, on the other hand, Table 1 can produce 2 L's with a capital of 50, the cost of an L is still 5, and a capital of 50 has been set free insofar as the former supply of the commodity is still sufficient. If Table 1 has to invest a capital of 200 to produce 40 L's, the cost of an L is similarly 5. There's no difference. There's no difference in the determination of value or that of price any more than there's a difference in the quantity produced in proportion to the capital advanced. But in case A, capital is released. In case B, extra capital is spared, given that twice the amount of production is required. And in case C, the increased product can be obtained only by a growth in the capital advanced, although not in the same proportion as if productivity had remained constant and the same extra product had to be supplied but at that same level of productivity. This all belongs in Chapter 1 of Book 3. Considered from the standpoint of capitalist production, if we have regard to the cost price and not the formation of surplus value, it's always cheaper to employ constant capital rather than variable. A savings in costs on the element that creates surplus value, labor, does the capitalist the same service as a rise in surplus value itself, as long as the governing production price remains the same. This presupposes, in fact, the development of credit and the superabundance of loanable capital that corresponds to the capitalist mode of production. Say I employ, on the one hand, an additional constant capital of 100 pounds, this 100 pounds being the product of the 5 workers over a year, and on the other hand, 100 pounds of variable capital. If the rate of surplus value is 100%, the value that the 5 workers have created is 200 pounds. The value of the 100 pounds of constant capital, however, is still 100 pounds, while as capital, it's perhaps 105 pounds. If the rate of interest is 5%, the same sums of money, quantities of value express very different values when their products are considered. The value of 100 pounds in constant capital and 100 pounds in variable capital advanced for production is expressed in completely different proportions in the product. Another factor as far as the cost of commodities from the capitalist standpoint is concerned is the further distinction that of the 100 pounds constant capital, insofar as this is invested not in raw material, but in machinery, etc., only the wear and tear goes into the value of the commodity, whereas the 100 pounds for wages must be completely reproduced in it. In the case of colonists and self-sustaining producers, who mostly have no access to capital or only at high interest rates, the portion of the product that represents wages is their revenue, whereas for the capitalist, it is a capital advance. They therefore consider how this labor cost as the proceeds of their labor, which is the most important thing for them. As far as the extra labor is concerned, after this labor cost is deducted, it is always realized in an excess product. And whenever they can sell it and valorize it or directly make use of it themselves, they consider it as something which has cost them nothing, as it has not cost any objectified labor. It is only the expenditure of objectified labor which is seen by them as an alienation and Taudeserung of wealth. They naturally seek to sell at as high a price as possible, but even a sale below the value and below the cost of production still seems to them like a profit, as long as this profit is not anticipated by any indebtedness, mortgages, etc. For the capitalist, on the other hand, the outlay of both constant capital and variable is an advance of capital. The relatively greater advance of constant capital reduces the cost price, other things being equal, as it also reduces the value of the commodities. Hence, although profit arises simply from the surplus labor, i.e., simply from the employment of variable capital, it can seem to the individual capitalist that living labor is the most expensive element in his production costs, which should be reduced to the smallest possible level. This is simply a capitalistically distorted form of the correct position that the relatively greater application of past labor as compared with living labor means a savings in the latter and a more plentiful supply of it. This is how everything appears from the standpoint of competition, that is, falsely. Page 507, manuscript. Assuming stable production prices, the extra capital investments can be made with constant increasing or decreasing productivity on the better lands, i.e., on all land from B upwards, the quadrant B upwards. On A itself, this would only be possible on our assumptions, either with productivity unchanged, in which case the land will continue to bear no rent, or productivity increases, one part of the capital invested on land of type A would then bear rent, the other not, but it would be impossible on the assumption of a decline in A's productivity, for in that case, the production price would not remain constant, but would rise. Under all these circumstances, however, i.e., whether the surplus product brought in as is proportionately above or below this proportion, and thus whether the rate of surplus profit on the capital remains constant, rises or falls as the capital grows, the surplus product and the surplus profit per acre corresponding to it grows, and so too, therefore, potentially does the rent in corn and money. The growth in the simple mass of surplus profit or rent reckoned per acre, i.e., reckoning the growing mass by a constant yardstick, and here, therefore, by a definite quantity of land, is expressed as a growth in the proportion. The rent, or the level of rent, reckoned per acre, thus grows under these conditions simply as a result of the increase in the capital invested on the land. And this takes place, moreover, with production prices remaining the same, and irrespective of whether the productivity of the extra capital remains the same, decreases, or increases. The latter factors modify the degree to which the level of rent per acre grows, but not the fact that it does grow. This is a phenomenon which is peculiar to differential rent 2 and distinguishes it from differential rent 1. If the additional capital investments were made alongside one another spatially, or new additional land of the appropriate quality instead of temporally in succession on the same land, the amount of the rental would have grown, and so would the average rent of the overall cultivated area as shown earlier, but not the level of rent per acre. I know that seems confusing, but he's just distinguishing, how in some sense it's a simple categorization, with the result remaining the same. As far as the amount and value of total production and the surplus product are concerned, the concentration of capital on a more restricted area increases the level of rent per acre, whereas under the same conditions, its dispersion over a greater area, all things remaining the same, could not produce this effect. The more the capitalist mode of production develops, however, the more the concentration of capital on the same area increases, so that the rent per acre rises. Hence, in two countries where production prices are identical and the differences between land types are also identical and the same amount of capital is invested. But in one country, this happens more in the form of successive investments on the same land, and in the other country, more in the form of parallel and coordinated investments on a greater amount of land. The rent per acre, and therefore the price of land, could be higher in the first country and lower in the second, even though the total rental in both countries was the same. This difference in levels of rent could thus be explained neither in terms of a difference in the natural fertility of the land types nor in the amount of labor applied, but exclusively in terms of the different kinds of capital investment. This is where, let me break here for a second and say, this is where we can make these distinctions among capitals. And as simple as it might be, this is exemplified not only in financial capital, but also in land relative to capital. And speaking of a surplus product here, in other words, let me stop for a second again. In other words, that's the difference between ground rent and rent on, let's say, a building. And you can make these same kinds of distinctions, which is really important anyway. Marx is not necessarily talking and thinking about, floors, of buildings, but I think you can see where he's headed and why that distinction, which with respect to land is not that different. It can be applied, but only if you sort of think about it, and which is what he's doing in opposition or in amplifying Ricardo's position or in commentary on the classical. Anyway, back to the text. And speaking of a surplus product here, we mean the aliquot portion of the product in which the surplus profit is expressed. Generally, however, we take surplus product to mean the portion of the product in which the total surplus value is expressed, or in particular cases, the average profit. The specific meaning that this term obtains in the case of rent-bearing capital can give rise to misunderstandings, as we saw previously. Now, finally, section 508B, 508, the falling price of production. The price of production may fall if additional applications of capital take place while productivity remains constant, falls, or rises, i.e. with a constant, a falling, or rising rate of productivity. This is the beginning of Engels' chapter 42, differential rent 2, the second case, the price of production falling. The equivalent of Engels' chapter 42 of volume 3 of Capital. So, page 847, 1, rising price of production. 1, falling price of production with the productivity of additional capital investment remaining constant, rate of surplus profit. The rate of surplus profit changes as the surplus profit itself changes. In this case, the product from the various types of land, corresponding to their respective quality, grows to the same extent as does the capital invested on the land. Now, this implies, given that the differences between types of land remain the same, a growth in production and also a growth in surplus profit proportionate to the growth in capital investment. This case, therefore, rules out any impact on differential rent of a surplus investment of capital on land of type A. On this land, the rate of surplus profit is 0. It therefore remains 0 since it is assumed that the productivity of the extra capital and hence the rate of surplus profit remains constant. It also excludes any further application of capital to A, whether this leads to an increase or a decrease in productivity. Maybe you want to put a shed on it. Under these assumptions, therefore, the governing production price can only fall when the governing factor ceases to be the production price of A. The latter's place the latter's place being taken by the next best land, B, or some other land that is better than A, i.e., capital is withdrawn from A or even from A and B if the production price of land C becomes the governing one, or so that all inferior land drops out of the competition between wheat growing lands. The condition for this, under the given assumptions, is that the extra product of the additional capital investment satisfies the demand, and hence the production of the inferior land A is superfluous to the supply required. Let us therefore take table 2 above, but assume that instead of 20 quarters, 18 quarters now satisfies the demand. A would drop out, with its production price of 30 shillings per quarter, would become the price governing land. B would become the price governing land. The differential rent then assumes the following form. This is table 4. And yes, you can see where it zeroes out and etc. Total is capital advance is 15 pounds, profit 3 pounds. Production cost is 21 and 2/25ths. Right? No, 2/3 shilling. 21 and 2/3 shilling. All right. Rate of profit, 20%. Product per acre, 18 quarters. Surplus profit is 9 pounds. Rate of surplus profit is 60%. Corn rent is 6 quarters. And money rent is 9 pounds. The total rent, page 848, the total rent, therefore, compared with table 2, would have fallen from 36 pounds to 9 pounds, and in corn from 12 quarters to 6 quarters, although the total production has fallen only by 2 quarters from 20 to 18. The rate of surplus profit reckoned on the capital would have fallen to 1/3 of its former level from 180% to 60%. The productivity of the various capital investments on B, C, and D would have remained the same. The decline in corn and money rent thus corresponds to a fall in the production price. Compared with table 1, however, there is simply a decline in the money rent. The corn rent in both cases is 6 quarters, but in one case, the money rent amounts to 18 pounds, in the other case to 9 pounds. On land C, the money rent was previously 6 pounds and is now 3 pounds, but the corn rent has remained the same as in table 1, mainly 2 quarters, and the same is true of land type D. In fact, the product of A has been driven out of the market by the additional production obtained from the uniformly operating additional capital, and land A is thus excluded as a competing agent of production, as a result of which a new differential rent 1 has been formed, in which the better land B plays the same role as inferior land A did before. B's rent therefore disappears, although nothing has changed in the differences between B, C, and D because of the investment of additional capital. The part of the product that is transformed into rent therefore falls. Now, I won't go through the next one because it is all about the computation. If the above result, the satisfaction of the demand with the exclusion of A, had been brought about by the investment of more than twice the capital on C or D, or both of these, things would have taken a different course. And in that case, we should have, and note that the translator points out a contradiction. Anyway, page 849 is table 4A, and it goes on. Yes, it does. And we will get lost in the numbers. So the point is, the total money rent reckoned on the capital advanced, as in table 4D, almost 100% of it in table 4C is somewhat less, but in table 1, it is 180% of it. It has thus fallen by more than 80%. The average money rent per acre has risen. Its previous average in table 1 was 4 pounds 10 shillings per acre over 4 acres. It is now 6 pounds on 3 acres. Its average on the rent-bearing lands was formerly 6 pounds per acre and is now 9 pounds. The average money rent, or the money value of the rent per acre, has also risen, and it now represents twice as much corn product as it did before. But the 12 quarters of corn rent are now less than half of the total product of 24 quarters, whereas in Table 1, the 6 quarters of rent made up 6/10 of the total product of 10 quarters. Thus, even though the rent has fallen, taken as an aliquot part of the total product, and similarly, if reckoned as a percentage of the capital advance, its money value reckoned per acre has risen and its product value still more. If we take land D, where changes in rent have taken place, the production cost laid out amount to 10 pounds 10 shillings, and the capital laid out is 8 pounds 15 shillings. The money rent is 15 pounds. And it goes on and even more complicated. I think there's a point. It just the proportions in which the latter must grow depends on how much the extra capital investment is divided between the better and the best types of land, assuming here that the productivity of capital on each type of land grows in proportion to its amount. So if the fall in the price were less extra capital would be required to produce the same money rent. If a greater supply were needed to drive A out of cultivation, and this depends not only on A's product, but on the proportionate extra capital, proportionate share that A has in the total cultivated area. If therefore a greater quantity of extra capital were also required on the land of better quality than A, the money rent and the corn rent would have grown still further, other things being equal, even though both disappeared on the land of type B. The reason why the invested capital is not entirely twice the former amount, although the productivity of the respective additions of capital has remained the same on all the land types, is that a quarter of the former total capital of 10 pounds, mainly 2 pounds 10 shillings, is no longer present. 7 pounds 10 shillings is left. Twice this is 15 pounds. On top of this, 3 pounds 15 shillings have been added to D, which makes et cetera, et cetera. And yes, it's a little detailed, let's put it that way. So if the differences between B and C and D were still greater, still less extra capital would be needed. The specific proportion depends, number one, on the ratio in which the price falls, thus on the difference between B and A. Number two, on the ratio of the differences between the better types of land from B upwards, and three, on the amount of extra capital invested on these lands. Manuscript 512, we see, in fact, that this law expresses nothing more than was already developed in dealing with A. That is, if the production price is given, whatever its level might be, the rent can rise as a result of extra capital investment. For the result of the exclusion of A from cultivation is a new differential rent 1, with B now as the worst land and 1 pound 10 shillings a quarter as the new production price. This is true. This is as true of Table 4 as it is for Table 2. It is the same law, simply that B is taken as the starting point instead of A, and the production price as 1 pound 10 shillings instead of 3 pounds. This is important here only for the following reasons. Insofar as such and such a quantity of extra capital was needed to withdraw capital from land of type A and make up the supply without it, it has been demonstrated that depending on the conditions, this may be accompanied by a rising, a falling, or a stable rent per acre, if not on all lands, at least on some, and for the average of cultivated lands. We've seen that corn rent and money rent do not behave in the same way. And, he shows the difference between Table 4, AB, and Table 4A, Table 4B, Table 4D, and the the differences among 6, 9 quarters, 10 quarters, 12 quarters, and corresponding money rent. With falling production prices, the corn rent must double for the money rent to rise again to a previous level. But at the same time, the corn rent of 6 quarters is represented in a smaller money rent of 9 pounds. That's table 4. And when the corn rent has risen by half to 9 quarters, the money rent is 13 pounds 10 shillings in table 4A. It is only tradition, however, that still gives corn rent any role. One might just as well prove that a manufacturer could buy far more of his own yarn with a profit of 5 pounds than he could formerly with a profit of 10 pounds. This does show, however, that while money rents are falling, the land-owning dogs can still make significant gains as producers of the raw materials and manufacturers of which money rents form a part. Number 2, Roman numeral 2, a falling price of production accompanied by a fall in the rate of productivity of the extra capital investment. Now, nothing new is involved here except that the production price can also fall, as in the case last considered, if the extra capital investments on better types of land than A makes A's product superfluous and hence cause capital to be withdrawn from A, or if A is applied to the production, well, let's say, of a different crop. This case has already been exhaustively discussed. We have shown that the corn and money rents per acre can grow, decline, or remain the same. It goes without saying that since here the excess quarters cost more, have a greater money value, a smaller capital investment is required to bring about the same result, although from the point of view of the product, there is greater growth in the capital applied. Compare, for example, Table 3 from page 505 in the manuscript and Table 1 from page 504 as follows. And so, yes, if we now assume that the 16 quarters supplied by B, C, and D with a declining rate of productivity is sufficient to remove A from competition, Table 3 now becomes as follows. So there's a modification and a shift, and I know you'll have trouble finding it, but it's sort of there, capital advance 1, 2, production cost 1, 2, product per acre 1, 2, acres B1, C1, D1. And this corresponds to Table 5 in Engel's published edition, published version. Page 856 here, with a declining rate of productivity on the extra capitals and a varying decline on the different types of land, the governing production price has fallen from 3 pounds to 1 pound 15 shillings. The capital investment has risen by half from 10 to 15 pounds. The money rent has fallen by almost a half from 18 pounds to 9 pounds, 12 and a half shillings, but the corn rent is by only a 12, from 6 quarters to 5 and a half quarters. The total product has risen from 10 quarters to 16 quarters, or to 160% of its previous level. The corn rent is somewhat over a third of the total product. The capital advance stands in a ratio of 15 pounds to 9 pounds to 9 pounds 12 and a half shillings to the money rent, whereas the previous ratio was 10 pounds 10 to 18. The previous ratio was 10 to 18. Production would only need to be increased by less than the 8 pounds 10 shillings for the money rent to be equal in both cases. Number 3. Manuscript page 513. A falling price of production accompanied by a rising price, a falling price of production accompanied by a rising rate of productivity for the extra capital. This is distinguished from B1 above, page 508, in which the price of production falls while the rate of productivity remains the same, simply by the fact that if a given surplus is necessary to remove A from cultivation, this happens more quickly in the present case, both when the productivity of the additional capital investments is falling and when it is rising. The effect of this process can be uneven, Sherlock, according to how the investments are distributed over the different types of land, depending on whether this varying effect tends to even out the differences or to intensify them. The differential rent on the better types of land will fall or rise, and so too, therefore, will the total rental, as was already the case with differential rent 1. Moreover, everything depends on the size of capital that is displaced with A, as well as on the relative amount of capital which has to be advanced, giving rising productivity to supply the excess product that is to meet the demand. The only point worth investigating here, and this takes us back directly to the analysis of how this differential profit is transformed into differential rent, is this. In the first case, A above, page 504, where the production price remains the same, the excess capital that might be invested on land A is a matter of indifference for the differential rent as such, since now, as before, land A bears no rent, the price of its product remaining the same and continuing to govern the market. In the second case, B, 1 above, page 508, where the production price falls and the rate of productivity remains the same, land A necessarily drops out, and still more so in B2, page 512. Falling production price with a falling rate of productivity, since otherwise the excess capital on land A would necessarily increase the production price here. However, where the production price falls because the productivity of the extra capital rises, the additional capital can be invested as well on land A as on the better types of land. We shall assume that a extra capital of £2 10 shillings invested on land A produces 1 1/5 quarters instead of 1 quarter. This is table 5. Footnote 101, which is table 6 in the Engels version. In table, this table should be compared with tables 1 and 2. In table 2, the doubled capital investment is combined with constant productivity in proportion to the capital invested. Here we've assumed a fall in the governing production price. If it were to remain constant at £3, the worst land, which previously did not bear any rent, would now yield a rent without drawing into cultivation any worse land. The reason for this is that productivity would have increased on land A, but only for a portion of the capital and not for the original capital. The first quarter cost £3 to produce. The next quarter cost only £2 10 or 50 shillings. Instead of this, the quarter is now sold at the average price of both quarters, less than £3 and more than the £2, £2.14, 6 and 11 shillings it cost to produce the quarter with the second portion of capital. Since the rate of productivity grows with the extra capital investment, this implies an improvement, which may consist in the application of more capital as such to each acre, more fertilizer, more mechanized labor, etc., or even in the fact that it is only with this extra capital that a qualitatively different and more productive investment of capital can be brought about. In both cases, a product of 2 1/5 quarters is obtained for an outlay of £5 of capital per acre, whereas with half of this capital investment, £2 10 shillings, the product was only 1 quarter. Leaving aside transitory market conditions, the product of land A would continue to be sold at a higher production price instead of at the average price, only if a significant area of land, Class A land continued to be cultivated with a capital of only £2 10 shillings per acre. But as soon as the new proportion of £5 per acre, and hence this improved mode of operation, became universal, the governing production price would have to fall to £2 15 shillings. The distinction between the two portions of capital would disappear, and then an acre which was cultivated with a capital of only £2 10 per acre would be abnormal and would cease to be cultivated according to the new conditions of production. The distinction would no longer be between the products of different portions of capital on the same acre, but rather between a satisfactory total capital investment per acre and an unsatisfactory one. From this, we can see, firstly, that when a large number of farmers have an insufficient amount of capital in their possession It has to be a large number, otherwise they'd be compelled to sell below their production price. That is, when a large number of farmers have an insufficient amount of capital in their possession, this has just the same effect as the differentiation of types of land themselves in a diminishing series. The poor type of agriculture on worse soil increases the rent on the better soil. It could even create a rent on better cultivated land of the same quality, which this would not otherwise yield. We see, secondly, how differential rent, insofar as it arises from successive investments of capital on the same total area, is actually reduced to an average in which the effects of the different capital investments can no longer be recognized or distinguished. They do not produce rent on the worst lands, but rather, number one, turn the average price of the total product, say on an acre of land, into the new governing price. And number two, present themselves as changes in the total amount of capital per acre required under the new conditions for satisfactory cultivation of this land, and not as the distinct results of individual successive capital investments, in which case the smaller original capital outlay would have had the decisive impact. The same is true then with the differential rents of the better types of land. Their differential rent is determined by the difference between the average product of the type of land in question and the product of the worst land in a situation where an increased investment of capital has now become normal. No land yields any product, wheat for example, without a capital investment. This is true even in the case of simple differential rent, that is differential rent 1 of type 1. When it is said that 1 acre of A, the land that governs the production price, yields such and such a product at this price or that, and that the better types of land, that is B, C, and D, yield some particular differential product, and hence at the governing price, some specific amount of ground rent, this always assumes that a definite amount of capital is applied, namely that considered normal under the given conditions of production, just as in industry. A certain minimum of capital is required to make it possible to produce commodities at their price of production. Where this minimum changes as a result of successive investments of capital on the same land in connection with improvements, this is a gradual process. As long as a certain number of acres of A, for example, do not receive this extra working capital, rent on the better cultivated acres of A is generated because the production price has remained constant, while the rent on the better types of land B, C, and D is thereby increased. But as soon as the new type of cultivation is spread sufficiently on an average to become normal, the rent for the rent-bearing lands falls again, and the portion of land type A that does not possess the average working capital must sell below its individual production price, hence below the average rate of profit. With a falling production price, this occurs when surplus productivity remains the same or even when it declines, because as a result of increased capital investment, the necessary product is provided by the better types of land, and A's working capital, for instance, is withdrawn, and A no longer competes in the production of this particular product, wheat, for example. The amount of capital that is then applied on average to the better land B, which now governs the price, is now established as normal, and in speaking of the varying fertility of the tracts of land, we assume that this is the new normal quantity of capital applied per acre. It's clear, on the other hand, that this average capital investment, for example, 8 pounds per acre in England before 1848 and 12 pounds per acre after 1848, is what provides the standard when rent contracts are drawn up. For the farmer who spends more than this, the surplus profit is not transformed into rent. Whether this happens when the lease expires will depend on the competition of those farmers who are in a position to make the same extra outlay. We're not referring here to lasting improvements to the land, which continue to provide an increased product with the same outlay of capital or even a declining outlay. Although these are the product of capital, they function just like natural differences in the quality of the soil. We can see, therefore, that differential rent, too, involves an element that does not develop as such in the case of differential rent 1, since this can persist independently of any change in the normal capital investment per acre. On the one hand, the results of different capital investments on land type A are blurred, their product appearing as an average product per acre. On the other hand, there is a change in the normal minimum, or the average quantity of capital outlays per acre, so that this change appears as a property of the soil. Finally, there is a distinction in the way the surplus profit is transformed into the form of rent. Page 860. And, we continue on. As far as the money rent is concerned, it is the same as if productivity had increased equally on all types of land with an unchanged level of capital investment. In Table 1, for example, if the productivity of the land doubled, the differential yield in quarters rises in the same proportion as the price of production falls. The number of quarters grown rises in the same proportion as the price of the quarter falls. Thus, the product and the money rent remain the same. This must have entirely the same impact in this case. The price of production falls, but the amount of surplus product from the second round of capital investment grows in the same proportion. Let us take the first case in differential rent 1, Table 1, and double the productivity of the same capital investment. Yes, and you can do the math yourself. Now, the point being is that the money rent would rise under these conditions if provided the proportionate impact of the additional capital was the same on each of the different types of land. The amount of capital had more than doubled and was concentrated more on the better rather than the inferior types of land, or if the additional fertility magnified the differences between the different types. Let us assume that the additional capital investments on B and C, for example, did not increase productivity in the same proportion as they did on A, so that the proportionate differences declined and that there was no growth in the product corresponding to the fall in price. In that case, the rent on D would rise, the rents on B and C would fall, and the total money rent would fall, and the corn rent would rise. It's Table 7. The money rent, finally, would rise if given the same proportionate rise in fertility. More additional capital was applied to the better lands than on A, or if the additional capital investments on the better lands acted with an increased productivity. In both cases, the differences would grow. Thus, the money rent remains the same with falling production prices as a result of increased fertility with increased capital investment. If the additional capital is distributed evenly among the types of land of different fertility and the investment itself acts proportionately on the different types of land according to the commercial difference between them, the corn rent rises. For the money rent, it is the same as if the capital investments on the different types of land had increased proportionally while the prices remained unchanged. The money rent falls, therefore, if the improvement resulting from extra capital investment reduces the difference, either all or some, by having more effect on A than on B and C. The fall is greater, the less additional fertility there is on the better types of land. Whether the corn rent rises, falls, or remains stationary depends on the degree of unevenness in this effect. The money rent rises and the corn rent with it, either if more capital is added to the rent-bearing land than to A in conditions where the proportionate differences in the additional fertility remain the same, and more capital is added to the lands of higher rent than to those of lower rent, or if, given the same additional capital, the fertility on the better and best lands grows more than on A. Indeed, in the latter case, the rent rises in relation to the degree to which the increase in fertility is greater in the superior categories of land than in the inferior ones. Under all circumstances, however, the rent rises relatively if the increased fertility, the increased productivity, is the result of a new addition of capital and not simply of increased fertility, while the capital investment remains constant. Now, this is the absolute point of view, and it shows that here, as in all earlier cases, the rent per acre, and now the higher rent per acre, as in the case of differential 1, the rent over the whole cultivated area, the level of the average rental is, and now the higher rent per acre is the result of increased capital investment on the land. Whether this functions with a constant rate of productivity in a situation of constant or falling prices, with a declining rate of productivity in a situation of constant or falling prices, or with an increasing rate of productivity in a situation of falling prices. For our assumption of a constant price with a constant falling or rising rate of productivity for the extra capital and a falling price with a constant falling or rising rate of productivity can be reduced to the assumption of a constant rate of productivity for the excess capital in a situation of constant or falling price, a falling rate of productivity in a situation of constant or falling price, and a rising rate of productivity with constant or falling price. Although the rent may remain stationary or even fall in these cases, it would fall further if the additional application of capital in otherwise unchanged conditions were not the condition for higher fertility. The additional capital is then always the cause of the relatively high level of rent, although this may have fallen in absolute terms. I will leave the listing of this for later, and since I've gone over my time, we may be able to complete this in the next session with a decent summary, but let me point out that the remainder does a lot of cogitation on these matters. Now, the point at the end will be about, we've dealt with this first way in which the rent can arise on the poorest land, A, without bringing into cultivation still worse land, namely the way in which it originates from the difference between its individual price of production, which was formerly the governing one, and the difference between the individual price of production and the new higher price of production at which the last bit of extra capital supplies the extra product needed on better soil, but with deficient productivity. So you have a variety of ways in which he's adjusted the differences and showed that they're not all the same, and they have proportionality, but they're not identical. So we may conclude that I've included, as I have before, a larger table that summarizes. Yes, there is a summary. There's a way of simplifying all this. And you can see that there are examples of a modern type that relate to differential rent 1, differential rent 2, monopoly rent, and absolute rent. And I've added to this the same sort of modern approach that is not considered necessarily by Marx, or it's an elaboration of Marx's argument by Dipankar Basu, a Marxist theory of rent. And I've included the abstract and the introduction and the conclusion. And I hope you get a little something out of that as well, because that's a way in which you can frame the differences among these things. And Basu works it out as a kind of comparative statics model, which, for our purposes in terms of describing all of this, that sort of works. All right. Now, thank you for your attention. I will now stop the share.